Ready?
Yep.
Joy.
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, you hear me count. I'll stop counting.
Okay.
5, 4.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another week, another episode of my show. I'm Jordan, and this is Taking a Different Perspective, where I talk, discuss, review, and analyze all things film and media. And so before I get into the content for today's show, I first just wanted to talk about something that, for anyone out there that doesn't know, you can consume this particular show in one of three ways. Either through the WBGR app while you're listening to it, because it is a radio show. You can stream it live on Facebook, or you can, if you're on Twitter, you are watching it via Periscope. But as of today, your girl is attempting to penetrate new markets, and so besides those three platforms, I am now streaming on YouTube as well. For anyone out there that doesn't know, one of my goals that I am actually working toward right now is to have my own YouTube channel where, basically everything it is that I talk about for this show, I would talk about on the channel, but, just make it a little more visual, the edits and the cuts and the sound effects, and make it a bit more personal. So yeah, I thought that the best way to try to position myself into that direction was to first start off on YouTube so that, the people could really see what it is that I do with this show or what it is that I can bring. So yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to everyone that is or that may be, watching this show on YouTube from here on out. And so going ahead and getting into the content for today's show, if you watched last week's show, then you would know at the end of it, I gave a bit of a hint for today's episode. I said something along the lines of, I'm going to be talking about a movie that came out pretty recently, but that also has the people divided. And so, like I said, I thought that it was a pretty good hint, but if you didn't get it, it's not a big deal. You know what it is that I'm going to be talking about today because you clicked on the video, right? So you saw the title of the video. And so, yes, I'm going to be talking about why Bright is actually one of the worst movies of 2017. One of the things that I saw in regards to the divisiveness of the reviews from this show is that mainly the people that mainly went up for this show were the people, were basically like the viewing audience, like the public. And then the people that didn't really like this show, the movie, the people that didn't like the movie, that thought that it was really bad, that thought that it was the worst movie of 2017, were more so the film critics and the people that actually have like a vested interest in film and media and things like that. And so with this particular show, I kind of wanted to try to bridge the gap and help the viewing public understand why it is that even though your experience with this movie may have been a pleasant one, why it is that, technically speaking, cinematically speaking, this movie was pretty bad and it did have a lot of flaws. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by saying that I don't think that Bright is the worst movie of 2017. There was this movie called Shot that stars Noah Wyle and Sharon Lill. She's the woman that plays Tyler Perry's wife in the Why Did I Get Married movies that I reviewed for the movie review blog Punch Drunk Critics that I write for. And yeah, that was the worst movie of not just 2017, but that I think that I've witnessed in my life, period. And so I don't know, like if you were at all curious as to why I say that, then definitely head on over to Punch Drunk Critics, and put Shot, type in Shot in the search bar, and look at my review. But yes, Bright is not the worst movie of 2017, but I will say that Bright is the worst backed movie of 2017. And what I mean when I say that is that if you were to go back to January of last year, or if you were to just go back to the beginning of last year, right? And if you were to look at the calendar for the upcoming movies that were supposed to be coming out, Bright was one of those movies that we were meant to anticipate. We were meant to look forward to that movie. And so And I say that because of one of three things, right? It had a $90 million budget, which in my initial reaction, where I reacted to the trailer on this very same platform when it first came out over the summer, you know, I talked about how I could tell that this that the money was put to good use. And I must say that after watching the movie, that was the case. The effects weren't horrible, and the world that I think that these filmmakers attempted to create didn't look amateurish. I think that it could have been a lot worse, and I know that we've all seen a lot worse with other movies. And so, yeah, I could tell that there was money that was actually put into the actual, makeup and setting and things like that. And yeah, I think it was put to good use. So moving on, another reason as to why we were meant to look forward to this movie was because of the big names that were attached to it. So you had people like Joel Edgerton, Noomi Rapace. She's the woman that played in that Monday movie on Netflix that all of you all go up for, and that's no shade. I thought that it was definitely one of Netflix's better movies. But yeah, she's in it. Ike Barinholtz is in it, and then Margaret Cho is randomly in it. But of course, the man of the hour, the man that everyone loves, Will Smith, is in it. And so, you know, these are a lot of known actors. They're not unknown. It's not like, you know, we didn't know who these people are. So, you know, that was another reason that we should look forward to this movie. And then also the fact that it had the Netflix machine behind it is also another reason. And even though Netflix has been pretty hit or miss when it comes to their original content, to me, that doesn't really matter, because now in the year of 2017, the title of Netflix, or the title of Netflix original, has enough clout behind it to where we are meant to essentially kind of position our attention toward that product, at least for a little bit. And so, you know, bringing in the fact that, like I said, it's the Netflix machine, it had a $90 million budget, and has these big name stars in it. We were meant to look forward to this movie. There was a lot that was riding on this movie. These people, they went out and actively promoted this movie like this movie was made by one of the big Hollywood studios. And so, you know, for them to think that the final product that they gave us was worthy of, you know, it being viewed by people is it's pretty hilarious to me, I must say. Now, before I get into the actual review, let me just say that I don't want for y'all to get me wrong, all right? I didn't, you know, with me saying that Netflix is the worst back movie of 2017, I don't want for y'all to think that I hated the movie, because that is not the case. It was actually a pretty enjoyable watch for the most part. Now, granted, most of the enjoyment that I got out of this movie happened because, you know, as I'm sitting here and watching this movie, I'm just in disbelief that, you know, these people, that I could tell that these people really believed in this movie and they really thought that it was really good, but the final product is anything but. But yeah, I was able to get through it, even though I had to watch it in more than one sitting. After about the first 50 minutes, I said, all right, I'm gonna have to stop this and come back to it. But I went back to it, and needless to say, I got through it. And I also don't want for y'all to think that I went into this movie just ready to rip it apart, since the early reviews came out, right, and it was panning it as the worst movie of 2017, because that is, again, not the case. Now, going back to, again, my initial reaction, one of the things that I noticed is that it appeared as though I was trying to be as impartial as I possibly could. I did try to give the movie the benefit of the doubt. You know, I didn't bash it, even though at that time I do think that the trailer had all of the makings for me to bash it, right? I looked at the trailer and I basically said, I am not going to rush to any quick judgments. I'm going to give this movie a fair assessment. And then the reviews came out, right? And it was panning this movie as being the worst movie of 2017. But still, I said, no, I am not going to rush to any quick judgments. I am going to give this movie a fair assessment. And then the movie came out. I clicked play. The movie started, and I saw that horrible Microsoft graffiti paint that was plastered all over the walls in the opening credits. And still, I said, I am not going to rush to any quick judgments. I am going to give this movie a fair assessment. And then by the 12-minute and 48-second mark, I could no longer live by that lie. I knew that the movie was bad and that I was in for an interesting ride. And let me tell you, it was an interesting ride indeed. Now, before I get into the actual movie, let me just tell you from here on out that the rest of this show is going to be about this movie. So that means that I will be going into depth. So that means that there will be spoilers. So if you have not seen the movie, and if you don't want for things to be spoiled for you, then please click away from this show now. But do come back to it, because I do think that what it is that I have to say is of value, and that, you know, it would hopefully help you to put things into perspective for this movie. Now, in terms of the synopsis, one of the things that I noted, and then I'm sure a lot of people noted about this movie, is that this movie attempts to tackle a lot, right? There's a lot that is going on in this movie. It is a cop crime drama that's reminiscent of Training Day or any kind of cop crime drama, really. It incorporates a mystical world that is reminiscent of Lord of the Rings and any movie that's about fairies or mystical creatures or anything like that. And then it also has a social commentary that is reminiscent of a movie like Zootopia. Now, even though I do think Zootopia did a much better job of, you know, in that whole area. But yeah, so what exactly is this movie about? Well, that is a great question. So it is set in what I am guessing is the future, but we're never really explicitly told whether it's our future or whether it's some alternate universe or dimension, or whether it's the future of some alternate universe or dimension, or whether it's meant to be present day 2017, where because of some events that transpired back in history, we are now coexisting with mythical creatures. Now, even though, like I said, we are never explicitly told, right, I inferred that it's, I'm guessing, the future of our world today. And so in this new world, there's this hierarchy that exists where fairies are at the top and orcs at the bottom, and we humans are existing just somewhere in the middle. Now, in this world, orcs are basically seen as being the scum of the earth, because in the movie it was told to us that they were on the wrong side of some war some 1,000 years ago, and now essentially, you know, these orcs are paying the price that their ancestors you know, for the ancestors, and they're now being discriminated against and ostracized by society. And of course, we know these are images and a narrative that draws a lot of parallels from our own society and our history. And so in this movie, we have Nick Jacoby, who was played by Joel Egerton, who is an orc, but he's referred to as being an unblooded orc, which basically means that he grew up in a part of the human population instead of the orc population. So in this movie, he's the first orc to ever be a cop, and he has been partnered up with human officer Dal Ward, who is played by Will Smith. Now, I must say that right off the bat, the relationship between these two characters was pretty weird to me, and I say that especially on the part of Ward, because in this movie, he essentially makes it known whenever he can that he does not like the fact that he has to work with this orc cop. But then whenever someone else brings it up that he's working with an orc and how they don't like that he's working with this orc cop, he basically shuts them down, and he says, you know, just because they're different, it doesn't mean that you can just disrespect them. Now, even though Ward isn't out here going on this killing orc spree, right? Like, we're meant to see Ward as not being this corrupt officer. The sentiments that he carries is still a part of like the same overarching mentality that the whole of society shares. And so I found his viewpoint on this whole situation to be pretty confusing. It's like, are we meant to understand that he doesn't like working with Jacoby? Does he like working with Jacoby? Does he not mind working with Jacoby? What is it? I don't know. So anyways, getting back into the actual plot of the movie. So then later on in the movie, we basically find out that there are cops that want to kill Jacoby because he's an orc. But then that whole threat basically gets taken care of right after they introduce it to us. And so that whole storyline is basically gone. And so then we learn about a wand that's really powerful that has the ability when matched with a bright, and brights are usually fairies. No human has ever been a bright. This is what the movie says. Now, what is a bright? Again, I do not know, but when the wand is matched with a bright, it has the ability to bring back the Dark World and the Dark Lord. Now, what is the Dark World and the Dark Lord? Again, I do not know. Your guess is as good as mine. And so then there's some magic task force that consists of fairies and humans, and they're basically the feds whose job it is to find this wand. And so throughout the movie, we see them trying to locate the wand. And so then we find out about some rogue fairies that are also trying to get the wand so that they can actually bring back the Dark World. But then one of the fairies ends up escaping with the wand, and then she ends up in the protection of Ward and Jacoby. And so we're meant to understand that, you know, that she's not one of the bad fairies, right? She's one of the good ones. And so then there is this shootout between Ward and Jacoby and some Latino gang, because the Latino gang wants to have the wand for their own, you know, selfish reasons. And then after that whole thing is taken care of, again, that's another threat that's introduced to us. And then like 5 minutes later, it's basically gone. So once that whole situation is taken care of, Ward, Jacoby, and the fairy end up getting kidnapped by these gangster orcs. And let me just say that the gangster orcs are probably the funniest thing about this whole movie, because gangster orcs, like, what? But anyways, so once they're kidnapped by these orcs, Jacoby the orc is actually the one who was killed first, and then they are about to kill Ward, but then the fairy, who for some reason wasn't handcuffed, wasn't tied up, didn't have some kind of search done on her, brings out the wand that she's been hiding all this time, brings Jacoby back to life, and then everyone is just in awe of what happened. And so I guess because of that then allows for Ward, Jacoby, and the fairy to just leave out of the front door. I don't know. And so then Ward and Jacoby become worried about saving the fairy girl, because then she starts getting sick, and we basically end up figuring out that the only way that they can do that is by the only way that they can actually save the fairy girl is by, of course, making her come into contact with the rogue fairies and the rogue fairy and her minions. And so then there's this big fight, and it turns out that Ward, who is a human, is actually a Bright. Now, let me just say that whole plot twist of Ward randomly being a Bright was really lazy. We are never given any kind of an inclination that Ward could be a Bright. We're never told that Ward is any different from any of the other humans. We don't know how or why Ward is a Bright. And so when they brought that whole thing in, and at the end they're like, well, he's actually a Bright, I was sitting there like, I mean, I guess. So yes, he ends up, picking up the wand, and it turns out that he's a Bright because basically anybody who isn't a Bright, if they touch the wand, they explode, and Ward does not explode when he touches the wand. So like I said, he is a Bright. So then he uses the wand, he saves the day, and then Ward and Jacoby get medals, and the end. That is the entire movie. So now let me get into my review. Now, right off the bat, I'm just going to go ahead and say that that the filmmakers do not give us a great setting to begin with. Now, yes, they do verbally tell us how things came to be throughout this movie. But I feel as though with this world that they are crafting, right, where it is so out there, right? You have humans, you have orcs, you have fairies, you have mystical creatures, you have wands, you have magic. With that kind of world, in order for us to really be invested in it, in order for us to really take it seriously, that we should have been shown all of this stuff beforehand. Because even though I do think that this was the worst back movie of 2017, I do think that this movie could have worked. Now I'm not trying to compare these two movies, because I know that they're in two completely different leagues, but the movie Star Wars, when it first came out, that was a pretty far-fetched idea, right? People heard, spaceships and all these creatures and things like that, and they thought that it was pretty corny. But one of the things that helped to ground people in the story and in the setting and in the environment and all that kind of stuff is the infamous epilogue that plays in the beginning of the movie that helps to set the stage for what it is that we're about to see. But with this movie Bright, we don't get that. We are thrown right into the middle of the story after the big war, and after, all these things happen that put us to the present day, after Jacoby joins the Force, after Ward and Jacoby are introduced, after the initial backlash that I know that both of them received for working together, and after they have already worked together. And I think that all of these bullet points could have been great milestones that, if they were put together, could have made a great solo movie that, had we seen all of that before we saw this particular movie, it would have helped to make the story that much more better and that much more interesting. And then kind of going back to the fact that, okay, yes, we are told about the history and things like that throughout the movie, right? So they spread out this information throughout the movie. Now, even though you all, because I've seen a lot of people kind of caping for this movie and saying, well, how can you be confused? Because they do explain the movie to you. Like they explain how things came to be and all the other stuff. And yes, that's true. But what ends up happening when they introduce that plot device and when it is that they actually explain it, because they don't introduce and explain in the same time period. I know, because I remember sitting there and watching this movie, and in that time thinking, well, wait, what is this? What does this mean? What does this have to do with anything? And so you're then sitting there and having to wait for them to explain all of this stuff instead of us seeing it beforehand and already knowing what it is. But even if they did want to take that route of essentially like throwing in these pockets of information throughout the movie, what I think that they should have done, instead of just verbally telling us, they should have also visually shown us, what it is that helped to create this world. Because, if you're not paying attention and they happen to talk about what the wand means or something like that, you're going to miss it. And then you're going to be confused throughout the rest of the movie. And so there's this motto that I'm just going to say is a part of the arts period, where they say, show, don't tell. And I think this movie is a great example as to why that is, because telling is one thing, but when you actually show it, you get that experience and you become more invested in the movie because you're actively experiencing it with the characters. So then going back to, being invested personally, there was a scene in the beginning of the movie with Will where he was supposed to be taking care of this fairy because he was being a nuisance. And then, he had his neighbors, his gangster, thugged out neighbors that were watching all this take place. And I must say that whole scene was pretty weird to me. And I say that because the juxtaposition between those two worlds couldn't have been any more apparent to me than in that specific moment. And I think the fact that at that point, right, this is the beginning and we weren't told anything about this world made me not believe it and made me not invested in it. To me, that's kind of like if a movie had Freddy Krueger and Barney just driving down a car, and that was the very first scene that we saw of the movie. Now, I'm not saying that movie or story couldn't work, because I think you can make a story out of anything. But if you're not giving the audience the proper context and the proper background story as to how all of this came to be, then that will affect the way that people view your movie. And I know that, trying to confuse your audience is something that I know that filmmakers try to do, but I know, okay, with this movie that the filmmakers were not trying to go for any kind of confusion whatsoever. And so the fact that I was confused throughout a lot of the movie says a lot. Now, moving on to a bit of news. Now, I don't know if you all have heard, but Netflix has already greenlit A Bright 2. Now, when I heard this news, I wasn't completely mad at that bit of information, because like I said, I do think that the movie could have worked. But if Netflix, if they actually do end up going through with this second movie, I think that what they need to do with the second movie is essentially make it a prequel and try to fix all of the problems that I noticed with this movie. One of the biggest problems being that we are not given, like I said, that proper context and that proper background. If they were to make it a prequel, basically give us all of that stuff that they talked about, but have it play out visually for us so that, it provides us with that reference point that was missing from this movie, and also provide us with justification as to why we should actually care about the story and the characters. Now, even though I think this is what they should do, and this makes the most logical sense, I don't necessarily think that Netflix is going to do it, because they probably think that, the little bits of pockets of information that they gave us is enough. But I don't think it is. And, if they actually do care about making a good story, then they would definitely take that into consideration. Now, as I've already said, in terms of the social commentary, I thought that could have been done a lot better. To me, the social commentary came across as being like an amateurish attempt at trying to craft these meaningful messages, which at some point I found to be pretty mixed. Like, for example, with the whole orcs being discriminated against. In the beginning, they basically try to frame that whole issue as being like a societal issue, and that, the orcs don't deserve that kind of treatment. But if you pay attention and pay attention to the rest of the movie, they basically end up blaming the orcs for where it is that they are currently like socially standing. And so again, mixed messages, don't really know where it is that we should understand that the movie is trying to go. Now, also talking about, how this movie attempts to tackle a lot, I actually think that that's something that actually ends up hindering the movie in certain aspects. So to me, I saw that it felt like there were some storylines that were maybe forgotten about and then maybe just thrown in. And I remember for me thinking, wow, okay, you guys are giving us this new bit of information or this new storyline, and I'm still trying to understand everything it is that you've already given me. So for example, like with the fairy storyline, they don't bring that storyline until like 50 minutes into the movie. Now, granted, the movie itself is like 2 hours long, so it's still, we still have like an hour left. But before that 50 minutes, we're never told anything about fairies or about a special wand or anything like that. And so when they do bring it into the movie, it comes really out of left field, and you're left thinking, okay, well, again, what does this have to do with anything? And then, you have to wait for them to explain it later on. Now, also, I found that that at times the movie was a bit too lighthearted, and then at other times it got really intense, or there were scenes that weren't as intense as I thought that they could have been. And of course, I think that comes from the fact that they were attempting to bring in so much into this movie, right? It's a cop crime drama. It has this mystical world. It's supposed to be a social commentary. And I don't know, to me, it just felt like the filmmakers didn't really know the kind of feeling that they were going for with this particular movie, where I think had they kind of focused in their attention a little bit and didn't attempt to take on as much as they did, that maybe it would have helped the movie. And so, and then I want to move on to the actual plotting of the movie. Now, I don't know if you all recognized or actually paid attention to the way in which I told you the plot of the movie, but if you did, or if you were to go back to when I'm telling you the plot, you will notice how in between a lot of the events in the movie, I say "and then." So you probably hear that and you're thinking, okay, well, so what? What does that have to do with anything? And well, that has everything to do with everything. Now, one of the things that writers do when creating a story is they try to stay as far away from the words "and then" as they possibly can. And I say that because one of the things that happens when you're writing a story, and it's kind of like a duh kind of thing, but you'd be surprised at how many stories and movies don't pay attention to this, is that they want for there to be causality between the events of their story. And so if you have "and then" in between those events, there really is no causality, because "and then" essentially means that anything can happen. One doesn't necessarily cause the other. So that's like if I'm writing a story and I say the girl's shoes were untied and then a spaceship fell from the sky. The shoes being untied doesn't necessarily cause the spaceship to fall out of the sky. And so what writers do focus on is to use words like "but" or "therefore," because those words actually create that kind of cause and effect that you're looking for in your story. So if I'm writing a story and I say the girl's shoes are untied, therefore she fell. There's that causality that we're looking for. But with the Bright plot, right, we get a lot of "and thens." So, it's Ward and Jacoby meet up, and then they run into a fairy with a wand, therefore they become target number one. And then they run into some killer cops, and then they run into a Latino gang, and then they run into the gangster orcs, and then they run into the rogue fairies, right? It's a lot of "and thens," and what that does is it basically makes the movie come off as feeling like a bunch of moments that were strung together instead of it flowing as much as I know that it actually could have. And so, to me, it felt like the writers already knew the kind of checkpoints that they wanted to meet within the story, and they made the story work around those checkpoints instead of it being the other way around, right? And instead of them being more flexible and more adaptable to the fact that, okay, yeah, we have these checkpoints, but starting with this one checkpoint, this leads us in a kind of different direction. Instead of kind of going and seeing where that direction takes, then they were like, no, we're going to stop right here. And we're going to figure out how we can make this meet that. And I don't know, sometimes, one of the things about writing that I know that you have to be open to is you have to be open essentially to anything. You can't just go into it saying, okay, I want to do this, want to do that, when sometimes, things don't happen that way. And then with the editing, I thought it was pretty lazy. There were moments that felt pretty out of place, like maybe they should have happened later on in the movie. And I could also tell that there were scenes that were kind of reshot or that were added into the movie because the filmmakers realized that there was too much of a plot hole. I thought that the writing was meh. There were some corny one-liners that I didn't think that was funny. I thought the movie as a whole wasn't funny. I could tell that they were trying to be funny, but the jokes ultimately fell flat. And then the vulgar language. Now, I'm not opposed to vulgar language by any means, but what was with all the F-bombs that they were throwing out? I don't know. Like, I'm not saying that curse words have to be meaningful, but when you're watching that movie, it's like they throw in these curse words and you're like, I guess y'all can do that if you want. The acting itself wasn't horrible. I actually think that's one of the things that the movie got right, but I'm going to go ahead and chalk it up to the actual actors because they're the ones that are acting and they're good actors, so it's not really saying much. Overall, this movie wasn't something that I was particularly looking forward to. I'm glad, well, I'm not going to say glad, but we'll say I'm glad that the movie did come out on Netflix because I do know that I wouldn't have actually paid money to see this in theaters, and I know that a lot of other people wouldn't have done the same if they were going to be completely and totally honest with themselves. And so the filmmakers, allowing for Netflix to produce this movie, I think was pretty smart on their part because You know, if not, had the movie come out in theaters, the movie would have bombed. Now, like I said, I do think that even though this movie was pretty bad, it did have potential. And I do think that Netflix not allowing for there to be, you know, early screenings or early reviews of the movie was pretty telling. That should have told me everything right then and there. But like I said, I tried to be impartial. And of course, if they do actually end up making a Bright 2, if Netflix was smart, like I said, then they would go ahead and make the second one a prequel so that, you know, we are able to understand everything that happened up until that point. Now, that being said, that is actually the end of today's discussion. Please, please, please don't just like this video, share it, retweet it so that other people can see it, because I do think that this is something of value that I do want for people to see. In terms of next week, I will be here same time, same day next week, 12:30 to 1. I can tell you right now for next week's show, it's going to be more of an informative discussion about something that I know that we all know about, but that we don't know about in the way that I think that we should. And so I do think that you should definitely tune into next week's show. I hope that you all actually enjoyed hearing my, but certainly not the only perspective on this Bright movie. You know, for the sake of starting conversations, because I love to be able to discuss whatever it is that I can. Tell me what it is that you thought about the Bright movie. Did you actually like it or did you not? Tell me, let me know why. And if you did like it, and if you did think that it was actually a great movie, did my perspective help to help you to understand why it is that even though you may have liked it, why it is still a bad movie? If not, tell me why. And if you don't actually think that Bright was the worst movie of 2017, then let me know what you actually thought, what movie you actually think deserves that title. But yeah, that is the end of today's show. Make sure you tune into next week's show, and I will see you all next week. All right, bye.